Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to solve a problem that happened to me recently around an automation that didn't finish. In a recent video I reviewed this Sonoff SWV, a great device that turns on my garden sprinkler. Link in the description if you want to find out more. The issue I had is that HomeAssistant turned on my sprinkler at 5 AM and by chance we had a power cut around that time. My home server is designed to restart after a power cut and bring online all critical systems, of which HomeAssistant is one. But as this is an automation with a delay timer, when HomeAssistant came back online, the automation lost the status, and the watering continued till 6 AM when I noticed a very wet garden. So in this video, we'll cover how to prevent against this so that you don't turn your garden into a swimming pool. So let's pull that plug and turn that tap off. Looking at what happened, the core issue is that when HomeAssistant restarts, all automations that are running will simply stop, and any delay timers that were running within these automations are simply reset as if they were never running. Remember that a restart could be because of a genuine restart for updates, a forced one due to a power cut, or HomeAssistant crashes. The results are the same. There are a few solutions to this issue. For instance, in my case, I could have created an automation that had two triggers, one that turned on the watering at a specific time and one that turned off at another time. But even that has potential issues. But we're here to talk about reliable timers, so we'll create a timer that will set at a specific duration for the watering of the garden. We'll use the fact that this timer can be set so that if HomeAssistant restarts, the timer will restore its status to before the restart and hence the timer will complete. Although there is one caveat, but we'll cover that later. We'll then create a new automation that capitalizes on this ability to restore the timer status even after a reset to make our garden watering automation more reliable. We're going to need a helper to make this work. Now, I don't have a video on helpers just yet, but a helper is a customizable variable that can store various types of data, allowing for users to create more complex and intelligent automations. So in our case, we'll create a timer helper that is set to 5 minutes and that counts down to 0 when the watering is started. To create a timer helper, navigate to Settings, Devices and Services, Helpers, press the Create Helper in the bottom right-hand corner. Scroll down and select Timer. Give it a name, in our case, Watering Timer. Optionally give it an icon, in my case, Watering Can. And set the time to the desired duration, in our case, 5 minutes. Now comes the most important part. Tick the Restore option. This will restore timers to their correct status after a restart. So if you have a power cut or simply restart HomeAssistant while doing updates, or forget the timers are running, the timer will continue and work correctly after a restart. There is, however, one caveat to this. If you are using the timer finished event and the timer expires while HomeAssistant is not running, then it will not trigger. Or to put it another way, HomeAssistant will not say a timer is finished at a specific time if it is not running at that time. Now press Create. So now we have our timer and it's set to 5 minutes. So how do we modify our existing automation to make it reliable and robust enough to be able to withstand a HomeAssistant restart? So first, let's have a look at our existing automation. This is a sample automation in my test environment, as my real sprinkler automation takes into account a lot more variables such as rain and soil moisture. Navigate to Settings, Automations. Search for and select your existing automation. So let's walk through the basic logic of this automation. At 5 AM each morning, the automation will trigger. It will turn on the sprinkler, it will wait for 5 minutes, and then it will turn off the sprinkler. Now we can see the flaw in the logic. If HomeAssistant restarts for whatever reason after the automation has started but before the end of the delay, then the automation will stop and the timer will lose its status and the watering will simply continue. Not ideal. So let's change this logic to take advantage of our new timer. Now before I start, let me say that this is one way and might not be the ideal or the optimized way, but I'm teaching you about timers, not optimized automations. To create our new automation, navigate to Settings, Automations and Scenes. Press Create Automation in the bottom right hand corner. Press Create New Automation. We'll start with the same time trigger. After all, we want to turn on the sprinkler at a certain time. Press Add Trigger. Search for and select Time. Enter the time you wish the trigger to action. I'll enter a dummy time for now, as we will be changing this later. Now, as we'll be using the choose command later in the automation, which will choose an action based on which triggered event occurred, we'll need to add a trigger ID. This will become clearer later on. Press the three dots in the top right hand corner of the trigger. Select Edit ID. In the trigger ID, type something that will describe the trigger, such as watering start. Next, we need a trigger for when the timer finishes. Press Add Trigger. This is when the state of the timer changes from running, which in HomeAssistant is called active, to finished, which in HomeAssistant is called idle. In the search trigger, type State and select. In the entity, type your timer name and select. In From, use the drop-down and select Active. In To, use the drop-down and select Idle. Now, as before, we need to enter a trigger ID so that we can determine which trigger occurred. Press the three dots in the top right hand corner. Select Edit ID. In the trigger ID, type something that describes the trigger, such as watering finished. Next, we need to enter actions into Then Do section. Press Add Action. Search for and select Choose. In option 1, use the chevron to drop down the section. Press the Add condition. Search for and select Triggered By. Your two triggered IDs will be displayed. Select Watering Start. Press Add Action. Search for and select Timer Start. Press Choose Entity and select your timer. Now press Add Action. Select Device. Search for and select your sprinkler. Select Action Turn On. Now let's add the option for when the timer expires. Press Add Option. Scroll down. Press Add Condition. Search for and select Triggered By. Select Watering Finished. Now press Add Action. Now press Device. Select your sprinkler. Set action to turn off. Press Save. Give your automation a name and press Save. And we're done. Now we can test it out. For our first test, I'll use the old automation that had the delay command. I'll adjust the time to trigger immediately and for the delay to be 5 minutes. The automation triggers as expected and the sprinkler turns on. And after 5 minutes, the delay timer finishes and the sprinkler turns off. Now let's retest, but this time I'll force HomeAssistant to restart immediately after the automation triggers by using the restart screen on the right. Now that HomeAssistant has come back and the delay timer should have expired as the 5 minutes has passed. But as the automation has stopped, the sprinkler will remain on until manually reset, or the next time the automation runs the following day. Now let's rerun the test, but this time using the new automation with the timer. I'll set the automation to trigger immediately, and the delay will be 5 minutes as we set in the timer. When the time is reached, the automation triggers and the sprinkler starts, and the timer starts to count down. If we leave the automation to run for the full duration, the timer will expire, the status changes from active to idle, and the watering stops as we would expect. Now let's rerun the test, but this time I will force HomeAssistant to restart after the sprinkler has started and the timer is still running. Press Restart, restart HomeAssistant, and confirm with Restart. HomeAssistant will now restart. As you can see, the timer continues to run on screen. This was simply the code in the HTML, but HomeAssistant has disconnected from the screen and is restarting. HomeAssistant now has completely restarted, and the timer is continuing to run. However, at the end of the timer, as HomeAssistant has restored the timer, it will successfully shut down the sprinkler, proving that the restore function works for timers and that the timer is more reliable and resilient to HomeAssistant restarts. Now, as you can see from this example, the process of implementing these timers is simple enough, but it does take some additional effort and knowledge of timers, entity states, and additional automation steps to implement. Personally, I implement these types of resilient timers on critical parts of my HomeAssistant, such as this example of the garden watering, as I don't want an additional swimming pool. But for non-critical delay timers, I tend to not bother and instead use the built-in functions. Hopefully in a future release of Home Assistant, even delay timers will be enhanced to be able to cope with restarts, and hence this workaround will not be needed. But until then, I'd recommend critical automations only. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then hit that like, comment and share, and if you want to see similar material, then hit that subscribe button. Or if you want to help out the channel and see similar material, then maybe become a channel member. And if I've helped your garden from becoming a swimming pool, then maybe a super thanks or a PayPal donation. It's really appreciated. Until the next one.